Hello there, John Cucurillo here, the life coach of your listener. Thank you for joining me for another episode. Today I'm going to be discussing the topic of what happens when one has intense resentment against the world, and also what happens when one externalizes their own suffering to society or the world. Now, this is a complex topic, and I would predict it warrants discussion in other videos or discussions with other collaborators in the future. But today I'd like to introduce this topic and my involvement with it and the significance that I believe it holds. As per usual, I'm not a mental health professional. If you are experiencing any concerns about your health, or mental or otherwise, please seek professional advice. What you see on the internet is not gospel, and I'm also not prescribing a particular system of belief or trying to denigrate any other person's system of belief. This is what I believe to be a useful discussion. Take these ideas for what they're worth. They're one perspective. Now, this is going to be a controversial topic because it involves the concept of how we sometimes perceive ourselves as victims. And this is particularly risky because often the accusation of perceiving oneself as a victim is used by people who are apologizing for some incredibly heinous acts. One might see in the media, for example, that when a particular incident of abuse, assault, domestic violence and similar comes to public attention, that some people might be seen as apologizing for the perpetrators by stating that the victim's complaints are nothing but cases of professional victimhood or people playing victim. Now, I'm not going to deny that people do shame victims, and they do sometimes blame the victims in order to deflect responsibility away from themselves or the real perpetrators for their personal agenda. I'm not going to apologize for those people, but considering ourselves victims in many circumstances is not an adaptive coping mechanism. It actually can make our suffering worse. And it's a phenomenon that I see quite often, and I don't believe it's being critically addressed in the way that it should be, because if it's not addressed critically, it's easy to misconstrue as victim blaming, especially when it's spoken of rather abruptly. So today I'd like to offer a critical analysis of this issue. Now, I've worked with numerous individuals who are mentally ill, and I'm still on my own journey of my own mental illness, so I'm quite familiar with how it feels to be stuck in a position in which you feel that nothing that you do in the world is going to make a difference to your own life or to other people's, and to feel a considerable amount of resentment towards the world. It's not an easy phenomenon to overcome, and I'm not going to pretend that it is. But it's important for us to understand why it is that we can feel like the world is to blame for our problems. So consider this as a theory or a model. From an evolutionary standpoint, when a larger number of negative events have occurred in our lives, or when a smaller number of quite catastrophic events have occurred, we have to make decisions based on what's happened. One of the ways that we make judgments about what's safe in the world and what's likely to happen and how to best protect ourselves is by using information about what's already happened. So if a lot of negative events have taken place and we've experienced a lot of negativity, the information that's most available to us is about negative events. And if we use what we perceive to be the law of averages, often what can happen is we use those particularly grave negative events or larger number of negative events to conclude that our life is simply going to be a series of negative events. Now, in evolution, we have to be able to make quick decisions about the world. As I've stated in previous videos, if we can't make quick decisions based on the information that we have available, then we couldn't survive because we would be too busy trying to find answers in ways that weren't feasible in our daily lives. But when the constant information to which we refer is information about negative events, and we're concluding that only negative events are going to take place, eventually what happens is what we refer to as the slippery slope phenomenon, which I've discussed in a previous video. Essentially, that involves one particular event or action on our part setting a precedent for how we should respond to similar events in future. And each time we make a response, the response that we make sets a new precedent. So if we start to perceive the world as an inherently negative place in which a large number of negative events are going to happen, and that is going to be the mainstay of our lives, each time a negative event takes place, it's going to reinforce that that's true. It's going to act as an I told you so moment, as a form of evidence that we were right initially to conclude that our life is simply going to be a series of negative events. Each time we observe a negative event and reinforce to ourselves that we're correct about what we've concluded about our life. We're going to take some action on that. In the early stages of this thinking process, we may simply feel discouraged or pessimistic about the event that took place, but we may continue to make efforts to try to resolve the issue or to live our lives as best we can. But after some attempts, what may then happen is we may, even at an unconscious level, start to reason that if the likelihood of our efforts is going to be that we're still going to only receive negative consequences, we might as well not make as intense efforts, or we might as well not try at all, or we may as well even interact with the world in an ineffective way, because the conclusion that we're subconsciously making is no matter how much effort I spend, no matter how much I try to be the best person I can be or do the best job that I can, positive consequences are not going to result. So I might as well just not put in the effort because it costs me a lot of turmoil, but it doesn't yield rewards. And if we do that every time something negative happens in our life, what we may be doing without noticing is responding in a progressively less adaptive or survival-inducing way each time we're making a response to a negative event. And what we may find after a period of time is if we compare how we're living our life, especially in the light of negative events now, to how we lived them or responded in the distant past, we may now be living our life in a significantly different way, or maybe spending noticeably less effort achieving our goals, simply because as time passed, we became less and less willing to expend effort because we concluded that there was no use in doing it because there was never going to be any reward to it. It can also be reflected in the ways that we interact with other people in the world. So, for example, if we misinterpret the way that people interact with us as being negative on their part, the first time we encounter these types of situations, we may simply feel somewhat confronted that somebody else is being negative. Even if they're not being negative, we may simply feel confronted. But as time passes, we may start to, again, reinforce to ourselves, the way that people interact with me is always going to be negative, so I may as well not spend any effort trying to be positive. It's not going to result in any reward. And again, over time, what we may find is that without realizing it, because we're believing that our reality is always going to be negative interactions because of other people's negativity, we may start to respond to other people in a negative way, a tone or using verbal or non-verbal communication that conveys negativity to them. And they may eventually start responding with further negativity, which to us reinforces that they were being negative all along. And again, without realizing it, our experience of the world becomes progressively more negative, because each time we've encountered negativity, instead of thinking about that event critically, we've responded in an automatic fashion that often involves our feelings rather than critical thought. And so, without realizing it, we're gradually degrading our experience. Now, again, from an evolutionary standpoint, one could argue that for us to try to deflect responsibility away from ourselves toward other sources has some type of evolutionary purpose, because if we internalize responsibility for everything that happens in the world, it can be quite anxiety inducing. So from an evolutionary standpoint, trying to place responsibility for negative events onto an external source may have the evolutionary purpose of attempting to prevent anxiety. Now, again, to a certain extent, that has an adaptive quality, because we can't take responsibility for everything that happens in the world. But if we take that approach for everything without a critical mind, we start to take responsibility for nothing, even the actions and events that are our responsibility. And so it's easy for us to not introspect and ask ourselves for each occurrence that takes place in our lives whether we should be taking responsibility or whether it's reasonable to assign responsibility to another source. And because of this distress that we're experiencing, we may not spend as much mental effort actually analysing the situation, and that's why we may place responsibility or blame on what are essentially abstract constructs like the world or society. Society doesn't exist as such. It's made up of a series of individual people that form a variety of different types of group. And society can function as a quasi-unit, an abstract unit in some way, because on a large scale, people do influence the way that each other thinks, feels, and behaves. But to simply place responsibility on society doesn't take a lot of mental effort. at least not as much as analysing each situation and asking which individuals are responsible. Am I responsible? Is responsibility on any one individual or on a number of individuals? So these negative thinking patterns don't take a lot of mental effort, and in the experiences that I've had professionally and also personally, when one is in a depressed state or a pessimistic state, it can be difficult to conjure mental effort and be able to critically think in the way that one would if one were in a relatively healthy or calmer state of mind. This makes sense from that perspective, but from an objective standpoint, this type of thinking isn't healthy. It doesn't actually help us have a better experience in the world. It simply perpetuates our existing situation by constantly, unconsciously leading us to interact in a negative manner in the world and then receiving negative consequences, which reinforces to us that the world is a negative place, and it always will be. Now, across the various facets of my life, I've experienced a large number of interactions with people that have involved discussing the situations of themselves and other people. Often, what I've found is that people actually have more choice in life than they think they do. And they often unconsciously reinforce or perpetuate their own situations through their choices of action. And the key phenomenon or idea that I've often found, which I believe is overall critical to this matter, is people often mistake not being comfortable for not having choice. Now, there are various general examples that I can refer to that are quite salient. A lot of people struggle financially, and when one analyses their spending patterns and how they spend their money, it becomes clear that there are many areas in which they could improve. They could spend less on unnecessary or non-essential products and services. They could reanalyze their options. Often when you present these ideas, what they'd often argue is, but if I don't have all this in my life, I wouldn't be able to live. I don't have a choice. I have to spend this much money. But often what they're spending their money on are luxuries, items that, while they make life comfortable or perhaps convenient, they don't facilitate a better quality of life, and they're not essential. In that circumstance, people have become so accustomed to living with niceties that when they face the prospect of living without them, they think that it would be so uncomfortable that they mistake it, again without critical thought, for impossible. They think that they don't have a choice. They have to live like that, otherwise they wouldn't be able to maintain existence. Now, if you're used to certain niceties, yes, your mental health may suffer noticeably if you have to live without them. But it doesn't mean that those are essential, and it certainly doesn't mean necessarily that society is responsible. I've often heard this said about the cost of living. Now, undoubtedly the cost of living is difficult, but often people's response is, society has allowed this to happen, or the world is responsible for this. At no point do they think critically about their own behaviours and their own patterns of spending. The same could also be said for certain patterns of interacting with people. So to give an example, in a previous episode you would have seen me talking to my friend Ariana Kulikov about the issue of gender dysphoria and gender transitioning and the mental health related aspects of that domain. And one of the key topics we discussed is that objectivity doesn't have to preclude compassion. We can interact with each other and still have the right to express our individual differences of opinion. Now, I've witnessed and had described to me multiple instances in which two people have been communicating about a particular topic and they've expressed differences of opinion. And one or both of the individuals involved have become quite hostile towards each other because one person simply expressed a difference of opinion that the other person found insulting. And as that conversation escalated, each person started to feel confronted, and the other person's disagreement was reinforcing to them the negative ideas that they'd already developed about the world. If one person supported a viewpoint that the other person assumed was detrimental, and they'd had many detrimental or negative experiences in the world, then that person simply expressing that opinion was reinforcing to them the idea that the world is a detrimental, negative, and harmful place, and this person is just another example of it. But without critically analysing that particular individual's point of view and why they held it, and specifically the specifics of what it was that they were actually asserting. Because sometimes all it takes is for a person to make a reference to an opinion and agreeing to even part of it that could prompt another person to assume that that person agrees with an entire ideology with which they disagree. I've seen friendships get destroyed that way over one insignificant conversation in which one person expressed an opinion and the other person assumed that just because they expressed one opinion or even questioned the other person's standpoint, that all of a sudden this person was just an example of a harmful, negative, and evil world. At no stages have I ever seen someone stop and ask themselves, what is it that this person's really asserting, and are they attacking me, or are they simply expressing an idea that's at odds with what I've expressed in this particular moment? Is there more to this? Perhaps I need to ask more questions, sometimes a large number of other questions. Again, I'd like to make clear here that I'm not suggesting that nobody is a victim of any external event and that we always have to blame ourselves for everything that happens in our lives. That's far from the truth. People do become victimized by other people's actions or by actions that are outside of anyone's control sometimes. This is important to acknowledge because often people do need assistance. What I'm proposing here is not that we start blaming ourselves for everything and always look upon people who have had bad events take place in their lives as always being responsible for them. What I'm proposing is that we start thinking more critically about how we relate to the world and we start taking more responsibility for our actions. I'll be the first to admit that life isn't fair, and the fact that I'm acknowledging that doesn't mean I think it's okay. If I could, I would change the world to make it a fair place. I would not hesitate, and I think most people would not hesitate if they could make the world a fairer place for themselves and for other people. But sometimes in life, we don't have a choice about what happens outside of us, and the only changes we can make are within our own lives. And often what I see is people constantly ruminating about their own victimhood and about the events that have taken place in their life. But as they do that, they simply continue to suffer, and often the suffering gets worse. If the suffering's only getting worse, then it's a very clear evidence that the strategy that you're using so far isn't making your life any better. So if your life isn't getting any better, wouldn't you want to take chances on potentially making it better if you could? Again, I'll be first to admit, change and dealing with challenges are never comfortable. Okay, I've mentioned in a previous video that people might often ask why psychotherapy doesn't work for them or why a particular form of interpersonal help doesn't work for them. And what is often discussed but can be easy to forget is that the process of change when we're facing personal turmoil is not easy. It involves a lot of personal effort, it involves facing and tolerating uncomfortable situations, and it involves learning to cope with them. When I say life isn't fair, what that also means is not everybody is going to experience life as easily as possible. What we can do though is tolerate the discomfort when finding solutions that involve changing what we do in interacting with the world and finding solutions and taking personal accountability. It doesn't mean having to take blame. It doesn't mean having to accept it when people commit wrongs to us and simply allow ourselves to be exploited. What it means is often the only control that we have is control over what we do. Even if changing what we do, whether it be a small part of our lifestyle or a large portion of our lifestyle, even if changing that can be rather uncomfortable and feel somewhat unsettling at first, sometimes that's the only option that we have that is actually going to result in a better life for us without causing us to further suffer and self-perpetuating that suffering and simply reinforcing to ourselves that the world is a hopeless place and that there's no point in us expending any effort because nothing will work. Taking personal responsibility, while it's not always fair, is sometimes the only option. And I'll admit I've had to live it. And I'll be the first to admit that it's difficult. I know within myself it sounds like victim blaming, okay? I know how it sounds. It's not easy, but I'm not somebody who wants to spread this idea simply because I don't believe other people deserve help. I genuinely believe that more people need to understand it because I believe we would be healthier within ourselves if we were to adopt it. So thank you for joining me for another episode. As per usual, if you are experiencing any concerns of your own in any aspect of your life, please do not take what you see on the internet as gospel. Seek professional help. This is not an advisory video. It's a video offering a perspective on a salient issue that may be useful to you in your critical evaluation of the world. If you agree or disagree, I would love to hear from you. I value different perspectives. Please feel free to contact me. And until next time, take care.